It started out innocently enough. The conversation between Jesus and his disciples started out like any other. So how did it so quickly disintegrate into rebukes and name-calling? What was going on here that would elicit such strong words from both Jesus and Peter? It all began when Jesus asked for a report from his disciples about what the public at large thought of him. What were they saying about him? What was the word on the streets, and to whom were they comparing Jesus? Some compared him to John the Baptist, which wasn't surprising since he had taken up John's message proclaiming the imminence of God's dominion. Some likened him to Elijah the prophet. Again, not a surprise considering the miracles that both of them were noted for performing. And others compared him to one or another of the prophets of old. Maybe Jesus' words reminded them of the prophet Micah, who said, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" Or maybe the prophet Micah, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." But then Jesus asked the fateful question, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter, always the one with a ready response, piped up with what he was sure was the right answer. "You are the Messiah." And Jesus said, "Hush your mouth," which no doubt confused Peter and probably the rest of the disciples. Wasn't he, after all, the Messiah? Peter, probably expecting praise from the teacher for providing the correct answer, instead received a stern warning to keep quiet. Well, I don't think it's because Jesus was being modest, and I don't think it was because the time wasn't right for his coming out party, and I don't think it was because Jesus was afraid of the authorities. I think it was because, although Peter had the right answer, he had the wrong idea of what it meant to be the Messiah. It happens all the time, this confusion of labels. I've experienced it, and I'm willing to bet that a lot of you have too. There are some people whom I would really prefer that they keep quiet than to boldly proclaim that they are Christian. Examples who come to mind are Kim Davis, members of the Westboro Baptist Church, and any number of political candidates who proudly spew forth venomous hate speech in the name of their God. And if I can't put a muzzle on their mouth, then I wonder if there's another name for my faith I can use for myself. It's just so awkward and embarrassing to share the same religious affiliation as some of the nut jobs who are running around out there. That's why I think Jesus told Peter and the disciples to not tell anyone about him being the Messiah. Just like the others' idea of Christianity isn't the same as mine, the disciples' idea of Messiah wasn't the same as Jesus's. They knew enough to realize that Jesus was the Messiah, but not enough to understand what that really meant. They thought the role of the Messiah was to deliver them from their enemies, in this case Roman imperialism. Messiah would make everything better, restore Israel to a place of greatness, and wipe away their suffering. They weren't ready to hear that his future not only included suffering and rejection, but ultimately death. And even though he predicted life after death, all they heard was suffering and persecution and rejection and death. They didn't want to hear about Jesus' suffering, and they sure didn't want to hear about self-denial as a requirement for discipleship. This didn't fit at all into how they imagined their future. Jesus was supposed to be the one anointed by God to overthrow Rome and most likely be crowned as King of Israel, which meant their own future included positions of power. And they weren't so keen on letting go of that potential of power. So Peter took Jesus aside to try and straighten him out, to talk some sense into him, to rebuke him for his crazy notions. But Jesus would have none of it. And things got so bad and so out of hand that Jesus even resorted to name-calling. Maybe you understand. I certainly do. I've also been known to refer to a few people who have pushed my button as spawn of the devil. The disciples wanted someone who would wipe away their tears and their troubles, someone who would ride in on a war horse and vanquish their enemies, a powerful someone who would wave a magic wand and end all suffering forever, or at least end the suffering of good people like themselves. So in an effort to make sure everyone was on the same page, Jesus called in the crowds so they could hear it along with the disciples. He spelled out as plainly as possible what it meant to be a Christian. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. But even 2,000 years later, we still aren't listening, are we? We continue to build mega churches instead of mega homeless shelters. We measure our success by the number of people in the pews instead of the number of lives impacted by our ministry. And when our lives spiral out of control, we demand that God remove our suffering so we can get on with our carefree existence. Or we insist upon a meaning for our suffering as if we are entitled to an explanation from God, instead of simply praying for the strength to endure. We shake our heads and tisk at the poor bumbling disciples who just couldn't seem to get it right, and we are no better than they. We don't know the first thing about selflessness if we're going to sit surrounded by the amenities of life while we debate the pros and cons of welcoming refugees into our midst. We are clueless about taking up our cross if we celebrate marriage equality in the U.S. while ignoring the brutality toward LGBT folk in other countries. And following Jesus is nothing but a joke if we do nothing about the poverty and hunger in our own backyard. We spend so much of our time and money and energy in avoiding suffering and avoiding the face of suffering, when in fact it's only by looking it square in the eye and embracing it that we experience any sort of freedom. The abundant life which Jesus promised doesn't happen unless you get your hands dirty and your heart broken. Mother Teresa said, "When suffering comes to you, welcome it with a smile. It is the greatest gift God can give you." And C.S. Lewis said, "Hardships prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary life." Suffering can stimulate compassion if we allow it. Earlier in Mark's Gospel, we read that as Jesus stepped out of a boat onto the seashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion, a word which literally means to suffer with. He had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. For him, compassion for the poor, the sick, the hungry, the unclothed, the widowed, the prisoned, and the orphaned was at the core of his ministry. And if we are to be followers, we must be willing to look suffering in the eye and respond with compassion. Suffering signifies a turning point in life. We must die, or some part of us must die, before we can live, or at least move forward. And if we avoid suffering, we avoid growth. Richard Rohr says that suffering doesn't accomplish anything tangible, but creates space for learning and love. Suffering gives us space to love. But suffering and self-denial is not what we want to hear about, is it? Our society tells us it's to be avoided at all costs. Embracing suffering and self-denial is countercultural, but so is Christianity. Or at least it's supposed to be. If it's not Christianity. I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I'm not there. Sometimes I'm with Peter and the disciples. I want nothing of self-denial. But if I'm ever going to grow in my faith, if I really want God to use me, I've got to say no to the part of me that insists on my welfare at the expense of those who are in need. Suffering is a part of life. It can transform us into stronger people of faith. It can inspire others to be courageous and compassionate. Or if we allow it, it can turn us into bitter and disillusioned people. It all depends on our perspective. It's a choice we make every day. Consider Malala Yousafzai, a Pakistani activist for female education and the youngest ever Nobel Prize laureate who took a bullet in the head. Her words and deeds were born from the suffering of her people. And likewise for Gandhi and Mandela and Martin Luther King Jr. and the founder of our own denomination, Reverend Troy Perry. Suffering, and only suffering, transforms us into vessels that can be used by God. So the next time you see suffering on the news, or on the street corner, or the next time it comes knocking at your door, don't turn the channel or turn it away. Try to embrace it and imagine how you might be transformed if you respond with compassion. May we each respond to the suffering around us in a countercultural way, with compassion and love. May we always stand on the side of the powerless and speak out for the voiceless. And when faced with our own suffering, may we look it square in the eye, sure in our belief that all things work together for the good of those who love God. Amen.